I'm issuing your friendly neighborhood content warning for just the whole gamut of situations that could be viewed upon unfavorably. I'm talking about children being in violent, exploitative situations, violence, beyond that, homicide. So if this just isn't your cup of tea, this probably won't be the video for you. For everyone else, please proceed with caution.
Hey guys, welcome to essentially one of the first videos on my new channel, and I'm so excited about this. We're going to focus on basically anyways, I'm excited.
I'm about to be on some real murder, hey. I'm telling you, man. Any nigga that ever looked at me wrong.
Imagine this, if you will, being 16 years old and finally, after screaming and clawing and throwing fists, losing the will to fight. Because no matter what you did, the attempts to protect yourself were in vain. As the person who you believe loves you has pinned you down and continues to hit you in your face like fist punch over and over and over again. You no longer protest against any further assaults. You grow to accept the exploitation the love of your life has forced you into. You go on to think that perhaps if I didn't talk back, if I brought home more money, they'll finally love me as much as I love them. Then, after another assault, you put on the best happy face that you could muster, and then you leave the small motel room that you share with your boyfriend. You want to prove that you can bring home enough money so that he will finally see you as a human being worthy of value. The location in which you work is just right across the street, but you didn't even start crossing the road before a middle-aged man, Johnny Allen, stopped his truck and asked you if you needed a ride. You then nod and hop right into his vehicle. Now, he could clearly see that you were in some kind of distress. So Johnny kindly asks you if you're okay. You break down, you open up, and you tell him what's been happening to you, that the man you're living with regularly beats and rapes you. But Johnny Allen didn't stop his truck so that you can tell him all of the events in your life that led you to this very moment. Once you realize this, you agree to the price that Johnny Allen has set, $150. And so the two of you go back to his house so that you can render your services. You believe that that amount of money will be enough for you to bring back to your boyfriend. You think, well, maybe he'll smile when I come home. So you resign to gritting your teeth and you just bear it. Just do the job like every other time. But that night with Johnny Allen didn't really go as planned. Perhaps it was your breaking point. You felt fear rising as he moved to grab one of his many, many guns that were in his possession. Or at least that's what you thought. So now, this is a matter of life or death. You had to be faster than this Johnny guy, reasoning that if someone was going to die on that day, at that time, it wasn't going to be you. It couldn't be you. So, at what felt like just a flash, you grabbed the small handgun your boyfriend ended up giving you that you had tucked away in your purse. And without any hesitation, you pulled the trigger. You start becoming more and more aware of the horror of what you just did. Panicking, you grabbed the cash that Johnny Allen promised you. I mean, it's not like you could go back home to your boyfriend who expected a certain amount of money for you to bring back. And then you fled. These are the very events, as told by Cyntoia Brown, that took place, that ultimately resulted in her being imprisoned for life while still a teenager. But I have a question, many questions maybe. My essential question is, what kind of led her down this path? How are some of the decisions we end up making? How are they influenced by the very systems that surround us? School systems, prison systems. So that's what I would like to explore with you today. I'm going to talk about Cyntoia Brown, her story a little bit, in relation to a larger topic. And that larger topic is the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is essentially a cycle that people get caught into. And this is exactly what these for-profit prison systems want. They want people caught in this cycle so that their funds never decrease. They only increase, essentially. The more bodies that fill the prisons, the more these prison complexes, or better yet, the shareholders, benefit. As per usual, there's a financial incentive involved here, and in this case, it is to get people as young as possible and for long as possible into the prison system.
When we left New York, we took the freight to go to Philly. The train pulled up at Newark and they caught us riding free. A brutal copper on the beat came in and beat me silly. Oh, I really must admit he made an awful tramp of me.
So, Miss Cyntoia Brown, something interesting happened. Oh, this is kind of an aside still. I'm going to tell you anyways. So something interesting happened as I was reading her own autobiography. I noticed a lot of early life similarities between myself and Cyntoia Brown, all of which I really had no clue of until I picked up her book for the purposes of working on the topic that would eventually evolve to the school to prison pipeline. To the point where I'm like, damn, if I had just a few more similarities, maybe reacted more outwardly during trying situations, maybe got caught doing things that I certainly did or allegedly did as a child, I could be sharing a prison cell with Miss Brown. It's kind of one of those there but for the grace of God go I situations. Not only were Cyntoia and myself born in the same state around the same time period, so we lived here around the same time, we were also both adopted. We did not know our birth parents. Another similarity that she and I share is that our adopted parents, our real parents, our parents, divorced while we were still kids. One of the more notable things that was similar between myself and Cyntoia Brown is that we're both of mixed race, and we both had similar reactions from other people around us because of being mixed race. We're biracial, African or Black, white, or of European descent. So this one is kind of important, as it seems to have acted as a catalyst for Cyntoia. During the time period that we grew up, being biracial was unusual. It was rare, and it was even frowned upon. It was common for social groups, even very early on, to basically segregate themselves along racial lines because of how unusual being of two races was, or it often meant that you stood out. Standing out wasn't really a good thing. Teachers and peers alike had some really intense thoughts. As was my experience, Cyntoia didn't really make friends and was sometimes bullied for being visibly biracial. Being unable to develop stable social bonds with peers can have some pretty negative consequences. My experience of this somewhat deviates from hers. Unlike Cyntoia, I had at least one person my age that was totally fine being a friend, being around me. And that was my twin sister, who was also biracial, obviously, who also experienced not being able to fit in because of the color of her skin. Again, though, Cyntoia had nobody, and she points to this early childhood experience for a purpose. Now, I believed at the time that it would be too burdensome, if not kind of embarrassing, that this was happening to me. So I didn't really talk to my parents about it at all. And Cyntoia even mentions a very similar thought process. And so she'd never mentioned it to her parents either. Now, my parents did notice that my sister and I weren't really making friends. And so they decided that once we started elementary school, to make sure that we had different classes. So we were separated, essentially. I think that this was a problem because what it did for me, at any rate, was make me feel really lonely. It didn't really change the dynamic that I was experiencing with the kids, with even the teachers, too. I was still not making friends. But now, I didn't even have my sister to at least play with me and talk with me. It made me feel even more isolated and alone. Now, this feeling is the same for Cyntoia. She didn't have a twin. She had absolutely nobody. That feeling of isolation and loneliness is something that became entrenched very early, and Cyntoia talks about this too, having had a very similar experience. It's not often that I can read a book by a person who has killed another human being and say, this is so relatable. But here we are. According to this advert for childhood development, during development, persistent isolation from one's peer group may result in detrimental effects regarding one's ability to socialize and form secure attachments. i.e., you don't know how to make friends and have healthy relationships. A form of relationship that you might see in cases where you find social isolation during early childhood development is one that is only understood in terms of reciprocity. You give, I get. I give, you get. Don't get me wrong, reciprocity rules work for social groups, but it isn't the end-all be-all of relationships. But it makes sense to me that some socially deprived children, as they age, still only understand relationships in these terms. Reciprocity is heavily emphasized during childhood. It is taught that these rules not only benefit the other person, but also benefit you. You've seen it work. You get a birthday gift from a parent and or guardian. This makes you happy. You love being happy. You love your parent and or guardian. Thus, in the simplest terms, gift equals love. In regards to social activity carried to an extreme, this essentially can look like the monetization of relationships. Some may go so far as to include the accumulation of debts. For those who only view their relationships from only the I give, you get, you give, I get side of the equation, you may end up doing some pretty dumb stuff in order to get people to like you. As an example, a kid in first grade may be all like, hey, that asthma pill looks like candy. Does it taste like candy? If so, can I have some? And then I'm all like, yes, of course, sharing is caring. Here you go. Will you be my friend now? And then I seemingly made a friend for that day during that time at PE. And we never spoke again. Of course, this is all hypothetical for legal reasons. What isn't just a hypothetical for legal reasons is Cyntoia Brown showing off a bottle of no-dose caffeine pills to her schoolmates because perhaps this would impress somebody. Besides, a 12-year-old Cyntoia didn't think that these applied to the stance the administration took against drugs because you don't have... I don't even know why this is a problem, actually. Anyways, we're at the point where I'm sitting here trying to figure out the perception of a young child, 12-year-old, about what is or isn't drugs, and rule violations relating thereof. And that's wholly unnecessary to do, because basically, Cyntoia Brown got caught with these no-doses and was subsequently expelled from school for drug possession. And I want to complain so much about the process of this in and of itself. At this stage, this is where Cyntoia basically begins her journey down the school-to-prison pipeline. So now we're at the expulsion portion of Cyntoia's ride. Now here's where her story greatly diverges from my own. Since unlike her, I didn't get caught showing off drugs that I brought with me to school. I did have a doctor's note because I do have asthma. I'm certain that it probably still would have been frowned upon if my school knew that I was dispensing my medication to other kids. Allegedly. So I have a relatively typical grade school experience, while Cyntoia gets expelled. This is where things spiral from bad to worse, as she continued her trajectory through the pipeline. When she transferred to alternative school, Cyntoia confirms much of what we'll discuss about this educational program. The school lacked resources. They didn't have mental health professionals. They didn't have special education professionals. Things that would meet the needs of struggling children. Instead, the school focused on what I call rural-oriented learning without any instructional coursework, of course. Here, in the school, kids sat in silence and worked independently from a textbook. Pause here for a second. Do you remember what you were like in grade school? Your pre-high school days? Maybe you were full of energy. Maybe you had a lot of questions. Maybe you were curious about things. The things that get beaten out of you once you enter the world of adulthood. It's hard for me to envision an environment where children independently work in silence without any interactions from other human beings for hours on end, being even created as an alternative for misbehaving children, right? For such children, possibly any children, this type of environment would probably be akin to a deprivation chamber. It's unsurprising that kids would want to avoid such a place, honestly. Cyntoia, with a few of her classmates, did just that and skipped school. They ended up going to one of the other kids' houses. Now, long story short, a parent who lived at the home caught them and ended up wrestling Cyntoia to the ground. This parent had them arrested and charged for breaking and entering. Oh, and assault. This is a whole nother thing, and you can read about this and judge it for yourself. Now, this marked Brown's first time in state custody at a juvenile detention center. Upon release, Cyntoia wasn't really able to catch up with her peers on an educational level and a social level. She reported that many adults viewed her with an air of suspicion. This meant that she was essentially the bad kid with no friends and little to no interest in the schooling material because, frankly, she didn't understand it. She was behind. Adults' preconceived notions of Cyntoia as being the problematic child caused them to arguably overreact to something that I, as a child, could have easily done and gotten away with, like bringing knitting supplies to school or not really paying attention to the lesson. So while I could skate by, Cyntoia found herself back in juvenile detention. You can read the details for yourself here, but be prepared to be frustrated like I was. So here we see a pattern emerging that is being funneled away from school and into prison. This is creating a further wedge between the kids who get sent to juvenile detention and society at large. Part of what contributes to this results from feeling and being alienated from one's peers. In Cyntoia's case, she wasn't really able to form healthy relationships. And simply put, there wasn't really enough time for her to form relationships and stable bonds, going to alternative school, juvenile detention, being released from that for a short period of time, and then back into juvenile detention. Being behind in schoolwork aside, reactions from the adults aside, having friends and a social life is everything to a preteen and teenager. I mean, you remember what it was like during that time when you were around this age. Having a meaningful social life was of extreme importance. A young Miss Brown was grossly deprived of this opportunity. Sadly, this is a very common experience among kids who find themselves traveling along the school-to-prison pipeline. And this experience only benefits the prison system, specifically the for-profit prison systems, at the expense of children. Good God. Well, why is that, one might ask? Because these kids end up doing what Cyntoia did. In search of a place where she could feel accepted unconditionally, she found herself in the company of less than reputable people. Now, these people were willing to set aside her criminal record for a price. These people took advantage of her young age, her poor social skills, and her need for human intimacy. They, in addition to the people she encountered while in prison, reinforced the juvenile understanding of relationship building as a quid pro quo, an understanding that if she didn't perform as desired by others, then she wouldn't be viewed favorably by them in return. Her understanding of others acting solely in their own self-interests as the norm became solidified. This made her vulnerable when she sought relationships. After being released, she went on to being abused by others, especially men, one of whom became her pet. Is that like a word that I can use? Is there a better word for this? Anyways, one of them became her pet and groomed her to sell sexual services for cash. And she was still a minor. So in other words, she was a victim of child trafficking. Now, in her young mind, that was actually a loving boyfriend, as long as she obeyed his every command. These were the circumstances in which Cyntoia Brown, at the age of 16, killed Johnny Allen. Still a teenager, she was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you, Willie Bosket, for setting that legal precedent. Now, she was referred to in court by the prosecutor as a teenage prostitute. Because aging up Black children never happens. During this whole process, she ended up being diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. The school-to-prison pipeline should truly be viewed as a disability rights issue. I will talk about that on my other channel. Here, though, I want to go into more detail about the school-to-prison pipeline so that we can all essentially understand it better in order to have an opinion on it, in order to analyze it further. I tend to look at this specifically from a more moral perspective because, in my opinion, This is a cruelty enacted on children that should have never been normalized in the first place.
This song is a train song. It's a song about a train.
This song is a train song where the engineer is Uncle Sam.
So we went through Cyntoia Brown's school experience, or lack thereof. For her, the justice system became heavily involved throughout her young life. And she's not an exception. The school-to-prison pipeline is designed for this purpose, specifically to impact children like her. As you can see, the school-to-prison pipeline isn't like those oil pipelines that keep bursting, spilling oil everywhere, but it may be equally as destructive. Now, what the school-to-prison pipeline is a nationwide phenomenon. And what happens is that children get removed from any educational opportunities, schooling, and then funneled into the criminal justice system. Some even end up funneled into the adult criminal justice system despite being juveniles, like by law. With Cyntoia's case, we see an intertwining of school disciplinary practices with the criminal justice system. And for some people, for some reason, this seems like an acceptable practice, an acceptable form of discipline for children. Just send them to jail. If we look back as to when this whole mess started, we can point to the enactment of zero tolerance policies. These are essentially disciplinary practices that have a predetermined punishment. And these punishments are typically punitive and exclusionary. If you want to take an adult parallel here, just look at mandatory minimum sentencing laws or the 3-strike law. These laws are seen throughout the United States criminal justice system. Children who go through the school-to-prison pipeline often experience the same set of circumstances. But again, this practice ultimately means children are being pushed out of education and into the criminal justice system. How this is accomplished with children, it is very consistent. And where this takes place is relevant. The place where children have the closest contact with the school-to-prison pipeline are in public schools that lack proper funding. So if you think about a train, your journey would start at your local train station. In this context, your local train station is a grossly lacking of resources public school. My word, this station is too fancy. Defund it more. Me as a politician says because I want votes. Now, what me as a politician did to the beginning of your train journey created a lot of down-the-line problems, such as trains not showing up on time and the need to stuff more people, a lot of people, maybe over capacity, too many people in any individual train car. Now, in regards to school without resources, we get underqualified teachers, overcrowding. Importantly, what these schools don't get are things like special education programs, counselors, hell, even books. So basically, your station probably isn't really equipped to efficiently and safely provide you adequate train services, i.e. trips. Not that kind of trip, or maybe that kind of trip if you're a multitasker. With these schools, you see a similar thing. Children aren't learning, and they aren't even really interested in learning. There's a lot of distractions pulling children's attention all over the place. And children, as you know, are well known for their superior attention skills. Now, this isn't really all that surprising because you got like 35 students to a single teacher. How do you even manage that? In addition to distractions, these children don't even have the learning material that they would need in order to actually learn, possibly grow, who will at some point be adults, making adult decisions about really important stuff. Voting. Some children just don't thrive in this kind of situation. They can't adjust to such a situation or such an environment. And frankly, no kid should really be expected to do so. There's no adult available to really aid specific kids who might be struggling, who are having a difficult time adjusting to this kind of environment, to any type of educational environment, sitting still, Not to mention, this is kind of like an in-your-face kind of social environment too, with a lot of people. It's overwhelming. This ends up pushing some children out of the place where they are afforded at least some type of educational experience, and even pushing them away from the potential to develop healthy social relationships. Anyways, the main point here is that perhaps the first part of a journey is missing the train, possibly, and then deciding just not to go back. Now, regarding the school to prison pipeline, the first stage is being removed from the educational process. The next stage that occurs, most likely in tandem with the first, is being subject to harsh disciplinary practices, which, if we look at them, they are forms of psychological abuse. Some go as far as physical abuse. Schools deprived of resources often resort to removing students. Again, I do believe this to be a form of psychosocial abuse, as the school essentially removed the child's ability to develop social relationships, to develop social skills. You know, the skills that enable people to interact with and among their peers. And because there aren't enough people to support kids through the various issues that arise from being alive, the schools instead enact strict mechanisms designed to control the child. Specifically control the child to perform in a very regimented fashion. Now, this isn't to say that structure is inherently bad, because it's not. But I am saying that the U.S. education system at large, the public system, doesn't really account for the way in which a child's brain develops, let alone account for individual variation of that development. Impulsive, erratic, antsy, any other behaviors that result in one being off in la la land are normal, especially so for kids. Now, often as consequences for the behaviors that should be handled by a qualified adult are handled by a police officer. Subsequently goes through the process of placing them in cuffs, essentially looking as if it's an arrest. Also that they can be escorted to the principal's office and told that they're suspended or expelled. So cool. This pathway, if you will, is a direct result of zero tolerance policies. Policies designed to, by default, impose high penalties without considering all of the events that may have taken place. Let's say a kid can't control an outburst of anger. So they decided to take the bologna sandwich I got from the cafeteria and throw the thing at Jimmy D. Okay, why did 9-year-old me, who came to school upset because my parents were arguing before I got onto the bus, and besides, Jimmy D was 100% lying. Why did I allegedly react the way that I did? Why was the sandwich thrown? You know what? The time and resources just aren't available to hash this one out. So who cares? Go get the resource officer, aka a cop, and remove that 9-year-old from the general school population. The emotional and psychological development of these children just ain't our problem. So 9-year-old me, maybe through like adrenaline being high, swiftly turns around and accidentally brushes the hand along the resource officer's leg. Now, all of a sudden, I caught me a charge and suspension for assaulting an officer of the law or government official while performing their official duties. Now, when my charges finally get dropped, 9-year-old me is still suspended. Now, I'm not going to school. And my mom can't afford to pay someone to watch me for 10 hours while she works. I'm unsupervised. Now here they just put me, and you too, since you're kind of riding with me, on the potential train to imprisonment. And I'm not the only one who's been suspended. In fact, Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white students for the same offense. So not only have I been left unsupervised, I'm also getting further behind in my coursework. Like really behind. Maybe I'll drop out. Now, all of these factors have been shown to increase one's likelihood of having some form of involvement with the American justice system. Lovely. But perhaps I won't get too far behind if I am able to find an alternative school to go to. Now, this is providing that where I live has those, as opposed to completely eliminating my rights to an education altogether. Next stop, alternative school. Choo-choo. Which is really just a prison where no one teaches, no one learns, academically speaking, but the inmates are released before dinner time every day and get to stay home on weekends and holidays. Now, as you're being escorted off the train, you may look around and decide, this place ain't too bad. Alternative school's temporary anyways, NBD. Well, optimistic opossum, I bet you didn't know that these schools, are often run by for-profit companies that aren't accountable to any educational standards whatsoever. Meaning, things like having a curriculum shouldn't really be expected here. Needless to say, this is quite troubling because students who find themselves in alternative schools are often the students who need more intensive attention regarding their education. This really isn't a recipe for success, and it shows. Now, too often when struggling students return to their regular school, they do so unprepared, resulting in kind of a ripple effect. Now, such a ripple effect may permanently position them into inferior educational settings, and via alternative school may channel them into the criminal justice system. These stops leading to the involvement with the existing juvenile justice system is much more likely to happen in cases where children lack procedural protections, that being due process required by the Constitution. Now, I read that there's one state where up to 80% of these kids are denied these protections, such as legal representation. This often leads to children being placed in juvenile detention for minor rule breaking, like being disrespectful to a teacher. I know this may be a controversial stance, but I'm not afraid to share that I think that children shouldn't be locked up for talking back to an assumed authority figure. That may just be me, though. Unfortunately, once a child has been sent down the pipeline, it's quite uncommon for them to come back. Their train jumps the track. Did you think this was a round trip or something? I hope not, because it wasn't. And I don't think it was designed to be so. Once these kids enter into the juvenile justice system, the barrier to re-entry into traditional schools are often impossible to overcome. So much so that the vast majority of these kids never complete high school. Now, if there's anything you know about today's society, even entry-level and low-paying jobs often require some kind of college education. And the thing about jobs is that we use them to get a thing we have decided is of value, that we then use to obtain the resources we need to stay alive. The circle of life as nature intended. Regarding the school-to-prison pipeline, you can clearly see that our society is setting up these kids to fail. It's as if the adults in the room intentionally designed these children's trips, knowing that the train will inevitably derail. Now, maybe you and I were lucky enough or wealthy enough to not be sent on this specific train. Perhaps you caught the train where you received some kind of K through 12 form of education and then went to college, causing you to graduate in debt up to your ears. The American dream. But that's an entirely different train than what Cyntoia Brown took. The other day I came across an article, and this article is about the various changes or additions to laws within various states across the United States. Now, one law that particularly stood out to me that was being applied to Virginia and Tennessee was called something like the Teacher Empowerment Law. What this law does, it simply gives teachers the legal right to remove a child from school. Now, as far as I understand, this law differs from just general practices and guidelines of schools throughout the country regarding the removal of students in a few key ways. The most problematic aspect being that a teacher can legally remove any student for any reason without due process, without parents, without the involvement of the school administration. This is a zero-tolerance policy turned law, and it's rightfully called exclusionary discipline. As we have come to discover, one of the biggest goals, if you will, of the school-to-prison pipeline is pushing students further and further away from educational prospects, and maybe even more importantly, it pushes children further away from developing healthy peer-to-peer relationships. Children and adults alike need and rely on social bonds. It allows us to find gainful employment, something we depend on for survival, and that's what we deem to be the most practical way of getting our needs met for some reason. Social relationships also allow us to lead happy and meaningful lives. I mean, would you rather live your whole life among strangers or among friends? Now, while I enjoy my many hours of alone time, I would personally rather my friends leave me alone than have no one to tell to leave me alone. Like with Cyntoia Brown, without healthy social groups, people, in order to fulfill the need for a social life, resort to unhealthy relationships. Children do this, but they seriously then have no awareness as to if that relationship is actually a good one to have. So we see an almost inevitable outcome for children who have been denied both an education and an opportunity to develop healthy social relationships, and that is incarceration. But unlike Cyntoia Brown, most of these people are imprisoned for nonviolent offenses. Children and youth misbehavior has essentially been criminalized through these zero-tolerance policies. But why? Why doth the school-to-prison pipeline even exist in the first place? Well, simply put, a mutually beneficial relationship was made between governments and for-profit private prison companies, both of which operate on the capitalistic principle of profit maximization, where capitalistic principles utilize racism and white supremacy in order to help maintain the structure of society, thereby maintaining capitalism as the status quo. Some of you may be wondering, how the hell did she come to this conclusion? 1 minute she was talking about Cyntoia Brown and juvenile delinquency, school-to-prison pipeline, and now she's criticizing capitalism. Are we seriously doing this? Well, yes. Yes, we are. The prison systems within the United States are extremely profitable. Criminality is extremely profitable. Crime pays in a variety of ways. But especially if we consider that all the way back in 2007, the United States spent $70 billion on probation, parole, and incarceration. And it's only since increased. The fact that this is so profitable explains why public school disciplinary policies support the pipeline to prison. In other words, under our current economic system, both private industry and governments mutually benefit from the commodification of criminality. Now, for clarity, crime is only behavioral rules and norms that, when violated, are subject to sanctions, as determined by a legally recognized community of people. It's well documented that these rules and norm violations are irrespective of whether or not they are harmful to anyone. What we find to be criminal acts are shockingly arbitrary, and due to this flexibility, any behavior and action can be criminalized. And so it is. We see this regarding behaviors of children, to where, before, these children were just troublemakers, but today, they're criminals. As police presence within schools increase, juvenile arrests for simply breaking classroom rules increase. These schools end up relying on the police for disciplinary purposes, no matter how minor the perceived infraction by the child may be. So, off to prison they go. For private prison corporations, the goal of profit maximization has led to two key areas of financial gain. One is the financial gain from government coffers, since the government legally promises a continuous flow of new inmates and an agreed upon number of retained inmates. This is so fucked up. Oh my god. The more prison cells that are filled, the more bodies in those cells, the higher the profits. Another way the private prison industry benefits financially is through inmate labor, as this labor essentially isn't subject to labor laws. To be quite frank with you, this is slave labor, and is often contracted out to other companies and other parts of the government, for a small fee, of course. I mean, we got private prison companies from abroad that invest in the United States in order to gain access to the large supply of prison laborers. It's no wonder that slavery is still legal in pro-capitalist America. Go watch my dude about the... I have another video kind of about this particular aspect. Go watch my video on that after you finish this one. I want you to think about this for a second. Companies from other countries are sending their businesses to America, not for the freedom of opportunity, no, but because the country in which they are based probably have prohibitions against slave labor. So they turn to us for that instead, as a cost-saving measure to maximize profits. Now here's the catch. If recidivism rates, those rates being about 80%, are anything to go off of, getting these bodies and laborers as young as possible into the prison systems is a surefire way to gain and maintain capital. It's long-term profits. And these private prison corporations know this. It's kind of part of their model anyways. They send lobbyists to influence the law And by influence, I mean they often write the laws themselves. All this for the sake of democracy. Some people actually believe. These companies support legislation regarding zero-tolerance policies because they know the school-to-prison pipeline is imperative for their bottom line. If one recognizes that the prison industry gains profit for every new inmate and that the U.S. incarcerates the highest percentage of their population compared to the rest of the world, it's quite easy and clear to see that these private prisons and prison-adjacent industries have really no financial reason to just simply go away. In fact, the natural drive for any business in a capitalist system would be to continue to increase profit and growth, which is what they do. By lobbying the government to maintain failed legal policies, these companies utilize capital to exploit the lives of adults and children who find themselves even partially caught up in their tide. And this leaves us with an increasing number of adults and children entering the prison systems. And unfortunately, a growing number of them are children, all for the pleasure and profit of an industry that pretends to be doing a public good. In fact, and this is totally an aside, CCA rebranded themselves to Core Civic, and they generated a motto, or they came up with a motto that basically said something to the effect of better for the public good. Well, while the pipeline consists of children of every race and class, you probably won't be surprised that, yes, it's mostly children from impoverished areas and children of color. Children like Cyntoia Brown. Children like Cyntoia Brown find themselves entering a system like this, and where it starts is because they want to gain friendships, not knowing that some caffeine pills would result in her expulsion because of the zero-tolerance policy that was in place in that school. Possibly is still in place in that school. And some people, a lot of people, never even bat an eye at this. It truly makes me wonder that if in the United States the majority of racial minorities were imprisoned, would anything even be done about it? I mean, we already know that our criminal justice system applies laws disproportionately, like Black Americans. They make up 40% of the prison population, but only about 13% of the general population. Coincidentally, or maybe not, African American children are also about 40% of the children who are expelled from schools. Not to mention that Black and Latino children make up 70% of the children who are arrested or given over to law enforcement while they are literally in school. But racism is a thing of the past, white supremacy doesn't exist, and capitalism is good, actually. The school-to-prison pipeline so clearly exists for the sole purpose of profiting off of children's bodies, their opportunities, and even their future. It traps these kids in a cycle of despair, where they become socially isolated and educationally set back, and those subject to this are often children of color, children with disabilities, and children living under poor economic circumstances. I didn't know how to word that, I'm sorry. And children in low socioeconomic communities. We're at a place where we seriously need to ask ourselves, and each other, is pushing children into the criminal justice system good for society? The fact that we need to ask such a question, the fact that we can ask such a question, should indicate to you that something is deeply wrong with the way our society is operating. And that's capitalism in America, baby! Can't help but wonder that if in the absence of the school-to-prison pipeline, would the events leading to Johnny Allen's death even have happened in the first place? Would Cyntoia Brown have found herself being abused by the person she believed loved her, the person who forced her into child sex trafficking? Remarkably, this is only a snapshot of how the school-to-prison pipeline impacts young Americans. In other words, Cyntoia Brown's story isn't particularly unique. What is unique is what happened to her as an adult. She was fortunate enough to be the center of a documentary, which ended up helping her story go viral. Additionally, while she was in prison, she did focus on educational pursuits, becoming that so-called model prisoner we occasionally hear about, and having a few dedicated people fighting for her release along the way. As said, in January 2019, Cyntoia Brown was granted clemency by the outgoing governor of Tennessee. She was released in August of that same year, but by this point she had already served over 15 years of a lifelong sentence. While this is definitely a remarkable outcome, is her story really any different from any other kid who has been sentenced to life in prison? From her own admission, her experience isn't particularly unique. Now, I'm pretty sure she doesn't even realize how much the school-to-prison pipeline impacted her life, as it does for many other kids, especially children of color. What I want you to know is that this is a result of a larger system at play. She is a victim of capitalism, and those systems were in place long before she pulled the trigger that ended Johnny Allen's life.
So, that's it for today. If you appreciate what we do here, let us know by liking, sharing our content, subscribing to the channel, and of course leave us a comment. We enjoy hearing from you guys, so reach out to us. For your convenience, we have our social medias linked for you in the description box below. And remember, do your best to stay out of trouble by not getting caught. This has been Andie for Criminally Left, signing out.
We interrupt our regular program schedule to bring you the following special report from ABC News, Washington.
Bobby Sands is dead. The 27-year-old member of the Irish Republican Army who went on a protest hunger strike 66 days ago has died. Sands, who was serving a 14-year prison term on a weapons possession charge, had been demanding special status as a political prisoner.
And I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the 3rd constituency.
To repeat, Bobby Sands, 27 years old, died tonight in the 66th day of his hunger strike.
We were both even born in January.